But the other thing I should say is, I mean, it could happen tomorrow. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it really could. I mean, Balaji is a guy who has given a lot of podcasts. He had a great podcast with Marty Bent recently, very long, and he drew some fabulous comparisons to the waning days of Soviet Russia, and before it really kind of just collapsed on itself. And the lies that were being told, the fake economic statistics, the fake politics, the internal dissension. I mean, all of the things that you see today in the West. The extreme politics, etc. So, I don't trust any of the numbers coming out of any of the government bodies these days. Two, I don't trust the stock market. Three, I think it's almost insanity to trade or to try to make economic predictions based on all these fake numbers in this kind of quote unquote fake economy. And my view is that really the only defense that investors can look for is to be in assets that they absolutely are sure will not be debased in the enormous debasement that must come if they want to keep the system running. Now, I say that if they want to keep the system running because there's a chance, slim, I think, but possible, that they'll actually take the default, let it all collapse route, rather than printing. But even in an all collapses route, lots of entities go bankrupt and bonds aren't worth much and stocks aren't worth much. And, as an example, during the Great Depression in the United States, gold did extremely well. So, because Bitcoin and gold don't have counterparty risk and they can't go bankrupt, they're just assets. I think that they would, on a relative basis, perform well, even in a collapse of the economy. Now, Bitcoin might still be $30,000, but if the general price level, in the United States, the general in the 30s, in the Depression, the general price level went down in some things by like 90%. Real estate prices fell by 80 or 90%. So your gold was locked in at $35 an ounce at the time, but that $35 bought a lot more real estate when the price of real estate fell 90%. So on a relative basis, it was a very good investment. And gold stocks during the 30s did extremely well. The big gold index was up 10x, 10 times your money from 1930 to 1940. So, and of course, Bitcoin didn't exist back then, so we don't know, we can't draw a comparable. But I think Bitcoin, the way to look at it is just it's digital gold. That's kind of how I see it. Yeah, it's certainly what they've done. And their choices are kind of complete economic collapse and pitchforks, and they all get thrown out of office. And, it's almost perhaps even kind of Mad Max-like, or they have inflation and, everyone's bitching about the inflation, but, at least the system keeps running and, all they got are a lot of people bitching, and then eventually, in my opinion, the bitching will get large enough that politicians will emerge who will say, okay, look, we've got a real money problem here. We need to do a reset. We need to do a reset. Really, we need to return the country to a sound money standard, because otherwise the inflation is just going to eat us alive. I don't know. It's possible they won't be smart enough to even see that. And we'll just go to hyperinflation. Of course, after which then everyone will see what happens with money printing. And then, most certainly maybe they'll try a couple of fake currencies, but no one will buy it. The only true solution in that instance will be to go back to a sound money standard. And I could see that. I could see that happening. So, one thing I will say is that having studied a lot of hyperinflations around the world, they're terrible because often they're terrible because sometimes they lead to war, but they're also terrible because, people get wiped out. But if you don't blow up the buildings or kill people, all the assets are still there. They're just in different hands, right? The people who had them, in currencies, they lost all their money. And, things get restarted and work reasonably well pretty quickly when you return to sound money. To me, the problem that the world faces today is that we are not on a sound money standard. And I think if you look through a lot of problems in our society today, I think, a lot of problems, it's not obvious at first that that's what they grow out of. But I think having seen, I was a kid in the 70s, and it's not like we were on a sound money standard then either, but we kind of had the remnants of one because we didn't break the gold standard until 71 when Nixon went off it. And, things worked reasonably well. And it was a reasonably fair society. And we had our problems. The Vietnam War was a disaster, which is actually what drove them to go off the gold standard. But anyway, yeah, so that's kind of how I feel about that. My sense is what will happen, what's more likely to happen is we have runaway inflation, very, very high inflation, perhaps even hyperinflation. And then a new crop of politicians emerges and says, hey, look, the money is broken. That's the problem. Vote for me and I'll fix the money. And yeah, then they would do a Bretton Woods. They would create a new American dollar, maybe 10 old American dollars equals one new one, and that new one is convertible into a fixed ratio of gold gold or fixed ratio of Bitcoin or fixed ratio of a commodity basket, including gold and oil and Bitcoin and a few other commodities. I mean, the money needs to be tied, though, to something with a supply that can't just grow forever, because what we've seen with this crop of politicians, really in every politician's, all politicians throughout history have shown us that once you give them the monetary lever, they're going to use it. They're going to use it to buy votes. They're going to use it to feather their own nest. They're going to use it to try and get ahead in the world. If they have control of the monetary system, they can make outcomes that benefit them take place. And that's the problem. That's the underlying problem, that they're not working on all of our behalves. They're working on their own behalves. I mean, and we, in the United States, I'm not sure where all of your audience is, but in the United States, it's just terribly obvious how broken it is, because you have people like Elizabeth Warren who get into the Senate and she's got a $60 million net worth. I mean, what has she ever done? She's only made she makes $280,000 a year as a senator. And she's written some books, she's given some speeches, but really $60 million? I mean, how's that not corruption in some way, shape, or form? I mean, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, got paid $7 million to make speeches to the banks that she was supposedly regulating. I'm sure that those banks who paid her $250,000 to come and make a speech didn't really view her words as being worth $250,000, but they sure as hell thought, hey, we better do this, because if we don't, she could look unfavorably on some of the stuff we're doing, and we don't want her to do that. So it's a soft bribe. There's a lot of that, right? It's a broken system.
I agree. There's definitely wrong incentives in politics at the moment, especially in the US. I think that's probably the worst place at the moment in that regard, or one of them. If you look at sort of countries that I guess have had these difficulties, Argentina, Lebanon, especially recently, they've sort of done whatever they can to prevent the local population from owning these sound currencies. You could say, confiscating gold, limiting what you can convert US dollars legally to.
Absolutely. In Argentina, the only four ways that will make you financially free for conversion. Governments benefit greatly by having fiat currencies. We all know that. And they try like hell to block the exits. They don't want you leaving. They want you in their currency, buying their bonds, playing their game. They want to be able to rob from you, and I mean, we've seen this recently. Maybe this is where you're going with this. We've seen this recently with this Operation Choke Point, right? I mean, Elizabeth Warren, who I mentioned earlier, she, said that she was going to create an anti-crypto army. And then she worked with the administration, the Biden administration, to come out and do everything they could to kill, banks and others that were doing business with people in the general crypto industry and in Bitcoin as well. And they wanted to make it hard. I mean, and as Barney Frank says, they assassinated Signature Bank, which was one of the banks that was a leading bank in doing business with crypto companies. And, they did a lot of things. They've done a lot of things to try to slow down the adoption of Bitcoin and alternative currencies, because, as much as some of them play dumb and say, oh, it's a worthless thing, and I think but many of them understand what a threat it is, what an existential threat it is. And so, they tend to try and throw sand in our eyes and mess us up. And, I think they've got more moves in their quiver. I mean, more arrows. They can, I think at some point they could tax us more heavily. In the United States, you already have to tick off a box on your tax return. The question is, have you dealt in or traded cryptocurrencies in this calendar year? Yes or no? Okay. Yes. All right. Well, now they know you have some crypto. They don't know you have Bitcoin per se, but they know who you are. And it's not far of a leap from there for them to say, well, we're worried about people cheating on their taxes, so we want you to tell us, what crypto you've got, where it is, what it's worth, etc. And you need to do that because it's state policy. And by the way, it's anti-American to not do that. Recall that in World War II, when they were running out of money to fund the war, they wanted everybody to put their savings into war bonds. And of course, Americans were very patriotic and wanted to defeat the Axis, and so many people did. Sadly, those war bonds didn't work out very well as an investment because their interest rates were low, and post-World War II, the inflation was enormous for a couple of years in order to get out from the debt burden that had been on top of us as a result of fighting in Toronto. So it's interesting times. Very interesting times.
During this period, what are the assets that you're looking to hold to potentially protect your wealth from this hyperinflation? I'm sure it's, there's Bitcoin, there's gold, but what else would you...
I've told people, just so people know, my personal allocation is about half Bitcoin, half gold. That's because I'm 66, and I don't want to have everything in an asset that can go down 70% in a year. But, and other than that, I would recommend real estate. Cash is never bad for flexibility. And hey, today you can get paid 5% risk-free on your cash. It's a nominal yield, not a real yield. I mean, it's still losing money against inflation, but you are getting paid something currently. Yeah. So, I mean, they're really the list, I mean, artwork, the list of assets that can't be printed is, and that are easily transferable too. It's not that long. I think as time passes here, a larger and larger percentage of the world is coming to understand the risks associated with fiat currency because they're seeing inflation that's just really bad. And that's usually the first eye opener, like, oh, what's this all about? And it's scary because you say, well, I'm living on a fixed income, or I'm XYZ age, I've got my savings. And you think to yourself, well, what happens if the price of gasoline does go to $10 or $15? I mean, can I afford to drive? What happens to my I mean, you're in the UK, what happens to your electrical bill? What happens to your heating bill? I mean, it's what happens to your food bill? I mean, inflation is a silent, deadly killer of people who save money in economies. And sadly, it's getting worse. I mean, and I don't think it will get better until we really do a major league reset. But I do think, to our earlier comments, that's coming. And maybe even as soon as the next 3, 4, 5 years. But I want to be conservative and give myself a little time. I think within a 10-year window it'll be all over. That puts us at 33. So, but I also think this period is going to look like the 70s. In the 70s, the stock market went sideways, big ups, big downs. The bond market did terribly, and the two best categories to invest in were oil and gold. And of course, you didn't have Bitcoin, so you can't measure it by comparison. But I think people who've invested in sound assets, oil, gold, Bitcoin, in the next 10-year cycle, they're gonna feel like the people who invested in the FANGs 10 years ago. The way the FANGs were really dominated. Kind of the growth and expansion of the internet. I think we're going to see that same phenomena in these sound money assets.